The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital, like skeletal fingers demanding entry. Marcus Rivera pulled his security jacket tighter as he walked through the main corridor, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The emergency lighting had failed an hour ago, leaving only the occasional flicker of his dying phone screen to supplement the weak, yellow glow of his flashlight. He shouldn't have taken this job. $300 to watch over an abandoned mental hospital during the worst storm in decades wasn't worth it. But his landlord's eviction notice had made the choice for him. The city had reopened the lower floors as a temporary emergency shelter, though most people had chosen to brave the storm elsewhere rather than spend a night in Hollow Creek's infamous halls. The building reeked of disinfectant and decay, a nauseating cocktail that seemed to seep from the very walls. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about this place, whispered tales of experimental treatments, mysterious disappearances, and patients who screamed until their voices gave out. The hospital had been shuttered 15 years ago after a scandal involving the chief psychiatrist, but the stories persisted. A door creaked somewhere in the darkness ahead. Marcus stopped, listening. The wind outside howled through broken windows, but this sound was different, deliberate, human. He was supposed to be alone on this floor. "Hello?" He called out, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Shelter's on the first floor if you need help." Silence. Then, softly, almost inaudibly, came a woman's voice. "You shouldn't have come here tonight, Marcus." Ice formed in his veins. No one had told him his name. The few people in the shelter downstairs had barely looked at him when he checked in. He gripped his flashlight tighter and moved toward the voice, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the empty corridor. Room 237 stood ajar, darkness spilling out like black water. Marcus pushed it open slowly, the rusty hinges protesting with a metallic shriek. Inside, illuminated by his flashlight, sat a woman in a faded hospital gown. Her dark hair hung in limp strands around a pale, gaunt face, and her eyes, when she looked up at him, seemed to glow with their own cold light. "Vera Blackwood," she said, as if introducing herself at a cocktail party rather than sitting in an abandoned psychiatric room at midnight. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus's hand trembled, making the flashlight beam dance across her face. "Waiting for me? Lady, you shouldn't be up here. This floor isn't safe." "And safe?" Vera laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a graveyard. "Nothing about tonight is safe, Marcus Rivera. The storm has awakened things that should have stayed sleeping, and now they know you're here." Thunder crashed overhead, and every emergency light in the building went out at once. The darkness that followed wasn't natural. It pressed against Vera's skin like cold silk, familiar and welcoming after decades of existing in the spaces between light and shadow. She watched Marcus fumble with his dying flashlight, his breathing rapid and shallow. Fear radiated from him in waves. She could almost taste metallic, sharp, tinged with the copper of barely controlled panic. "Your light won't help you see what's really here," she said softly, rising from the bed with movements that seemed to flow rather than step. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold linoleum. "I've been watching this place for 73 years. Marcus, I know every shadow, every whisper, every soul that can't find its way out." Marcus backed against the doorframe, his flashlight beam wavering between her face and the empty corners of the room. 73 years? That's impossible. You can't be more than 30. Vera smiled, and in that smile was the weight of decades spent neither living nor dead. Time moves differently when you're caught between worlds. I was 26 when I died in this room. 26 when Dr. Thorne's experiments went wrong and left me tethered to this place like a ghost who forgot how to haunt properly. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Frost began forming on the windows, despite the humid storm air outside. Marcus's breath came out in visible puffs. "I was a nurse here," Vera continued, moving closer with that same fluid grace. "I tried to protect the patients from what Thorn was doing. The electroshock therapy, the experimental drugs, the surgery on conscious patients who begged him to stop. When I threatened to report him, he made me his final test subject." Marcus's back hit the corridor wall. "This is insane. You're probably a homeless person who got in during the storm. There's a rational explanation. The collectors are coming, Marcus." Vera's voice cut through his denial like a blade. "They feed on fear, on despair, on the kind of hopelessness that seeps into a person's bones and never leaves. This storm isn't just weather, it's a summoning. Every time the barometric pressure drops this low, the barriers weaken. And tonight, a sound echoed through the hospital, not quite human, not quite animal. It seemed to come from everywhere. At once, a low keening that made the broken windows vibrate in their frames. Marcus felt it in his chest, a resonance that made his heart skip. "Tonight they're hungry," Vera whispered. "And Dr. Thorne is awake." The lights flickered once, twice, and died completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, Marcus heard something that made his knees buckle, the sound of footsteps approaching. From the far end of the corridor. Slow, deliberate, accompanied by the scrape of something metal dragging across the floor. "He's coming," Vera breathed against his ear, though he hadn't heard her move. "Stay close to me, Marcus. I may be dead, but I remember what it means to protect someone." Dr. Cornelius Thorne had forgotten what it felt like to have a heartbeat, but he remembered the intoxicating rush of absolute power over another human being. The storm had awakened him from his restless slumber, and now he drifted through the halls of his former domain like smoke given malevolent purpose. His presence made the air thick and suffocating, charged with the residual agony of 1,000 screaming patients. The living man, Marcus, reeked of terror and confusion, emotions, as nourishing as fine wine. But it was the woman who truly drew his attention. Vera Blackwood, his greatest failure and most persistent irritant. After 7 decades, she still refused to simply fade away. "My dear Vera," his voice resonated through the walls themselves, seeming to come from every surface at once. Still playing nursemaid to the lost and frightened? How wonderfully predictable. Thorne's form began to solidify in the corridor ahead of them, starting as a shadow that gradually gained substance. Tall and gaunt, with silver hair slicked back and small round glasses that reflected no light. His white coat was pristine despite decades of death, and in his hand he carried the same electric probe he'd used in his final fatal experiment. Marcus pressed himself against Vera, his flashlight beam passing harmlessly through the doctor's translucent form. "This isn't real. People don't just ... Ghosts aren't." "Reality is subjective, young man," Thorne said, his smile revealing teeth like yellowed piano keys. "I spent years studying the elasticity of the human mind, how far consciousness could be stretched before it snapped entirely. You'd be surprised how malleable reality becomes when subjected to the proper stimuli." The corridor around them began to shift. Doors that had been sealed for decades groaned open, revealing glimpses of rooms filled with rusted medical equipment and restraint tables. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched no living heartbeat. "The hospital remembers," Vera said, her voice steady despite the supernatural chaos unfolding around them. "Every scream, every procedure, every death. It's all still here, waiting." Thorne laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I gave this place purpose, my dear. Before me, it was just another warehouse for society's inconvenient minds. I transformed it into a laboratory of human potential. My research was on the verge of revolutionary breakthroughs when small-minded bureaucrats shut me down. Your research was torture, Vera snapped, and for a moment her form became more solid, more present. You destroyed lives for your own twisted curiosity. I expanded consciousness. Thorn's form flickered with rage. I pushed the boundaries of human experience beyond their natural limitations. And you, my stubborn little nurse, you could have been my greatest success. Instead, you chose to remain trapped in this mediocre existence between life and death. The hospital shuddered around them. Windows cracked, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear other voices, patients and staff who had never truly left. Their whispers filled the air like a chorus of the damned. Marcus found his voice. What do you want? Thorn's attention focused on him with the intensity of a surgeon's scalpel. Want? I want to finish what I started. 73 years of interrupted research, of questions left unanswered. You, Mr. Rivera, have the most wonderfully responsive neural patterns. You could help me complete my work. The electric probe in Thorn's hand began to hum with malevolent energy. The sound made Marcus's teeth ache and his vision blur. Run, Vera whispered. The stairs to the basement. There's something there he doesn't want us to find. But as they turned to flee, the corridor stretched impossibly long before them. Doors, slamming shut with deafening finality. They were trapped in Thorn's domain, caught between the living world and whatever hell the doctor had created in the spaces between. Timothy Ashford had been 12 years old when Dr. Thorne's experiments killed him, but death had aged him in ways that flesh and bone could never understand. For 7 decades, he had watched from the shadows, too frightened to intervene, too angry to fade away. Tonight, as the barriers between worlds grew thin, he finally found the courage to step into the light. He materialized beside Marcus and Vera as they pressed against the sealed doors, his small form flickering like a candle in the wind. His hospital gown was the same faded blue as Vera's, but smaller, heartbreakingly small. There's another way, he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of decades of silence. I've been hiding from him for so long, but I know this place better than he does. I know where he keeps his real work. Marcus stared at the ghostly child, his mind finally accepting what his eyes were showing him. You're just a kid. Timothy's laugh was bitter beyond his apparent years. I was a kid. Now I'm something else. Dr. Thorne said I had an exceptional capacity for psychological manipulation. He wanted to see how far a young mind could be pushed before it broke completely. The corridor around them continued to shift and warp, but Timothy seemed unaffected by Thorne's influence. He moved to a section of wall that looked identical to every other, pressing his translucent hand against what appeared to be solid plaster. He built a hidden chamber, Timothy explained, as the wall shimmered and revealed a narrow passage behind the main laboratory. That's where he kept his real research, experiments he didn't want the hospital administration to discover. Vera nodded grimly. I remember rumors. Patients who disappeared from the rolls but were never discharged. Staff members who asked too many questions and suddenly found new jobs in other cities. They squeezed through the passage, their footsteps echoing strangely in the narrow space. The air grew colder with each step, and Marcus could feel something pressing against his mind, not Thorne's aggressive intrusion, but something subtler. Whispers of other voices, other souls trapped in this place. The passage opened into a circular chamber that had never appeared on any hospital blueprint. Medical equipment from the 1950s lined the walls, electric shock machines, surgical instruments, restraint devices that looked more like torture implements. In the center of the room sat a metal chair surrounded by copper wiring and glass tubes, filled with unidentifiable fluids. This is where he brought me, Timothy said, his form becoming more solid as they entered the chamber. Where he brought all of us for the final procedures. He believed that extreme trauma could unlock hidden potentials in the human mind. Marcus approached the chair, his flashlight revealing dark stains on the metal restraints. "How many?" 47. Vera answered. "I kept count, tried to document everything before my final session." Timothy pointed to a wall covered in filing cabinets. "His research notes are all there. Every procedure, every subject, every failure and success. He preserved it all because he believed someone would eventually continue his work." The temperature in the room plummeted as Dr. Thorne's presence filled the space. His voice echoed from every surface. "Clever children. But you've only succeeded in trapping yourselves with my life's work." The chamber doors slammed shut behind them. The ancient medical equipment began to hum with electrical energy, and the copper wiring started to glow with an unnatural light. 47. Subjects. Thorne's form materialized beside the chair. "And tonight I'll finally have my 48th. The completion of my research into the elasticity of human consciousness." Timothy stepped forward, no longer the frightened child who had hidden in shadows for decades. "Not if we destroy it all first." But Marcus was staring at the filing cabinets with growing horror. "There are hundreds of files here. This goes back decades before the hospital even opened." Thorne smiled his terrible smile. "Oh, my dear boy, this hospital was built around my work, not the other way around. I've been conducting research into the human condition for far longer than you could possibly imagine." The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow as he rifled through the files with trembling hands. The dates went back over a century: 1890, 1905, 1923. Dr. Cornelius Thorne had been experimenting on human subjects, long before Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital had even been conceived. The building had been constructed around his work, a monument to decades of suffering disguised as medical treatment. "You're not just a ghost," Marcus breathed, staring at photographs of patients from different eras, all bearing the same expression of absolute terror. "You're something else entirely." Thorne's form solidified completely, no longer translucent, but flesh and blood made manifest through sheer malevolent will. "I transcended death through my research, boy. I discovered that consciousness, when subjected to sufficient trauma, can break free from the limitations of mortality. I am the living proof of my own theories." Vera moved to stand beside Timothy, both spirits drawing strength from each other's presence. "You're not living," she said firmly. "You're just too stubborn to die properly." The electrical equipment around the chamber began to spark and hum with increasing intensity. The copper wiring grew so bright it hurt to look at directly. Marcus realized that Thorne was preparing to conduct one final experiment, using Marcus as the subject and the Fae, supernatural energy of the storm, as the power source. "The files," Timothy whispered urgently. "If we destroy his research, we break the connection that keeps him anchored to this place." But Thorne had heard. With inhuman speed, he lunged toward the filing cabinets, his hand crackling with the same electric energy as his probe. Marcus grabbed the nearest file cabinet and yanked it over, sending decades of research spilling across the floor. "No!" Thorne's scream of rage shook the entire building. "You don't understand what you're destroying. The advancement of human knowledge, the evolution of consciousness itself." Vera and Timothy began gathering the scattered papers, their spiritual forms becoming more solid with each document they touched. As they held Thorne's research, Marcus could see other figures beginning to materialize around the chamber, dozens of patients and staff members, all the souls who had been trapped by the doctor's experiments. "We remember," one of them said. A woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1940s. "We remember everything," added a man in patient's clothing, his eyes reflecting decades of accumulated pain. The spirits began to converge on the scattered files, each soul reclaiming a piece of their stolen story. As they touched the documents, the papers began to smolder and burn with a cold, blue flame that gave off no heat, but consumed everything it touched. Thorn lunged desperately from spirit to spirit, trying to save his work, but his form was becoming less substantial with each destroyed file. You're destroying everything. Centuries of progress. We're freeing everyone you hurt, Vera said, holding a thick folder marked with her own name. As the flames consumed it, she began to glow with a warm golden light, including ourselves. Timothy was the last to find his file, a thin folder that contained photographs Marcus wished he'd never seen. As the boy's research burned, his form began to fade, but his face was peaceful for the first time in 7 decades. "Thank you," he whispered to Marcus, "for not being afraid of us, for helping us remember that we were more than just his experiments." The chamber began to collapse as Thorn's connection to the physical world finally severed. The doctor's form flickered and writhed, his face contorting with rage and disbelief. "This is not possible," he screamed as the spirits of his victims surrounded him. "I am beyond death. I am eternal." "Nothing is eternal," Vera said gently, reaching out to touch Thorn's face with a hand now blazing with purifying light. "Not even suffering." The last thing Marcus saw before the chamber filled with blinding radiance was Thorn's expression changing from rage to something that might have been relief. Then the building shuddered, the walls cracked, and he found himself running through corridors that were simultaneously collapsing and healing themselves. He burst through the main entrance just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Behind him, Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital stood intact and empty, but somehow different, clean, at peace. The storm had passed, leaving only puddles and the fresh scent of rain-washed air. Marcus walked to his car, his hands steady for the first time in hours. In his pocket, he found a small folded note that hadn't been there before. In elegant handwriting, it simply read, "Thank you for staying, Vera." As he drove away, Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror and saw figures standing in the hospital's windows, dozens of people in various period clothing, all waving goodbye. They looked happy, finally free to move on to whatever came. Next, the building itself began to fade in the morning light, not disappearing, but becoming less present, less important. By the time Marcus reached the main road, Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital looked like nothing more than an abandoned building that had been empty for years, which, he supposed, was exactly what it had always been.